Going to play a little bit of music while we allow for our wonderful guests to start rolling in.
Jill, you're Becky's cousin? Is that?
Becky's sister-in-law.
Oh, sister-in-law. That's right. Sister-in-law.
Yep. Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so pleased to be here tonight. We are discussing The Accidental Suffragist with author Galia Gichon and our guest, DC-based author Jill Santopolo. Thank you all for being here, and let's go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. For anyone who is unaware of who we are and what we do, I'll tell you a little bit about who we've got going on tonight. We are Lost City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore located in Adams Morgan, owned by Adam, no relation, who is a veteran dog lover and longtime resident of DC. We have a close-knit team, which is a collection of some of DC's coolest kids, and I hope I'm one of them. We have artists, educators, musicians, writers, and of course, avid readers all coming together to create this unique environment and curate an eclectic selection of books. I'm your host for tonight, Shady Rose. I'm very pleased to be here. Galia Gichon, widely quoted in the New York Times and more, Galia Gichon spent nearly 10 years writing financial research for top investment banks before launching Down to Earth Finance, a top personal financial advising firm in New York. Very impressive. Galia is the author of My Money Matters, a personal finance book which received notable press from the New York Times, Today Show, CNN, Newsweek, Real Simple, and more. Galia consistently leads seminars for Barnard College, where she has taught for 13 years, and other organizations. She is an avid angel investor focusing on women-led and impact startups and actively counsels startups through accelerators. I know that we're here to discuss your book tonight, but I also want to hear a bit more about that too.
Now, there's actually very many themes between educating women and money in my book. So.
Absolutely. Jill Santopolo is the internationally best-selling author of the upcoming Everything After, More Than Words, and The Light We Lost, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick and has been optioned for film. Very exciting. Her books have been translated into more than 35 languages and have been named to the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Apple, and IndieBound bestseller lists. She is also the author of the Alec Flint Mysteries, the Sparkle Spa series, and the Follow Your Heart books. Jill holds a BA in English Literature from Columbia University, an MFA in Writing for Children from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and a certificate in Intellectual Property Law from NYU. She is the associate publisher of Philomel Books, an imprint of Penguin Young Readers Group, where she edits many critically acclaimed, award-winning, and best-selling books. And last but not least, The Accidental Suffragist. We're going to talk a little bit about what this book is about, and then we're going to dive right on in discussing the book itself, and we'll even get to read a little bit of an excerpt later, which I'm very excited about. It's 1912, and protagonist Helen Fox is a factory worker living in New York's tenements. When her eldest daughter dies in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, Helen is seduced by the suffragist cause and is soon immersed, working alongside famous activists. As Helen's involvement with the cause deepens, she encounters myriad sources of tension that test her perseverance: estrangement from her husband, who is blindsided by his wife's sudden activism, ostracization by neighbors, unease at working side by side with wealthier suffragettes, and worry about her children as she leaves them to picket the White House in Washington. The narrative spans World War I and concludes with the triumph of 1919. In a time when the obstacles for women, from any background, were insurmountable, Helen discovers her voice as an independent woman and dreams of equality in a male-dominated society. And without further ado, let's welcome our guest for tonight. Hello.
Hi. So happy to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for including me in this event.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you to Lost City Books for hosting us.
I am so very excited to discuss this book with you today. We got a little to chat a little bit about it in the preamble before we started the live stream. But I'd love to hear a bit about your perspective on writing this novel. Something you mentioned to me before we started was that this book is intended to entertain, but it is undeniably a feminist novel. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, I'm an avid fiction reader. I probably read one fiction book a week or a few a month, and so I love to read. It's escapism. It's a chance to learn about new things. But at the end of the day, for me, and they always say write for yourself, don't write for your readers per se. But I wanted to write something that I felt like would really entertain. But as I was writing the books, I really thought of this when I started writing. I thought, oh, this is historical fiction about a time in history that I find interesting, that I would like to learn. But as I wrote it and I was researching it, I thought this is a story that must be told. And while the book starts in 1911, 1912, and really goes to 1919, throughout the years that I was writing the book, I realized that over 100 years ago, some things haven't changed. And while we have come so far, there's also so much that was so relevant for today and the time, from when the Me Too movement hit a few years ago to what's going on now. with the voting laws. So I felt that this book actually, the underlying story of the feminist struggle and the feminist really obstacles is something that I really want the reader to walk away with and be entertained.
Absolutely. And so, Jill, as you were reading this novel, I'd love to hear kind of what your perspective is. What were some of the elements of not just the feminism, but the story and the characters that jumped out to you?
Um, I thought I thought the relationships were really, really fascinating. And there were so many interpersonal connections between Helen and her friends in the neighborhood she lived in, Helen and the women that she worked with who are from a different sort of societal space. And then also Helen and her children and Helen and her husband. Um, and I I would love to ask you sort of how how you decided to frame all of those relationships and kind of what you were saying with each of them, because they all felt like they were speaking to the society at the time and the story.
Mm-hmm. Um, so it's interesting because, as I'm sure you know, as an author, first of all, I rewrote this book a few times, and I really struggled with how to write her husband and her relation with her husband, because I thought, well, I can go the way of sort of the stereotypical male and just make him very like, no, Helen, you can't do this, and kind of what was portrayed in the media at the time. But I didn't want to do that, and I actually I wanted to show that she was fighting and she was really learning to become independent. But at the end of the day, there were things that you couldn't deny in terms of like she needed her husband's permission. And she also wanted to have intimacy and she wanted to have a relationship with him and she didn't want to let him down. So I had to make their relationship a little more complex than initially just like him saying, no, you can't. And she said she wants to, which is, I think, my initial way that I wanted to write it, because that was really more how it came to me. So it was a push and pull. And in the very beginning in the book, I don't know, it's almost like, you know, it doesn't, he actually is involved in the labor unions, which was a really big deal. But then when Abigail died, you know, he just stopped. So he really had like his causes of his own. So he was, you know, a little more multidimensional than just her husband. So that was something that was really important to me. And she wanted his approval and she wanted him to support her. Like she didn't want to just do it and fight against him. So that was something that I held on to. And if anything, I almost wish I could have written more about their relationship. And then with her children too, like when her son Walter, at one point he goes to war and he goes to fight in World War I, and I researched a little bit about that at the time, and really like everybody wanted to fight that war. I mean, it was just the patriotism at the time. So, you know, she was a little bit anti-government just because she felt that Wilson had let her down and not pass the amendment. So she didn't want him to go, but there was no denying that having a son who was a soldier and having a son, you know, and wanting him to do better than from their status in life, but also wanting something for her daughter and wanting them to graduate high school and wanting them to have jobs. Like that was not something that someone in her class or her economic status really wanted for their children, or just maybe they wanted it, but they had no hope that it would actually happen or see the fruition of that. So, you know, I felt that how do you write a character who wants something more than maybe what her status in society allows for without making it seem implausible? So that was something that I really not struggled with, but, and then her friend Iris, I thought it was interesting. Like her friend, of course, supported her. They were best friends. And especially when Abigail died, her friend really was there for her. But Iris wasn't going to join the suffragist movement at all. And that was really why they brought Helen in originally, because they wanted to bring people from the lower East Side and from the tenements to join the cause. And it was really, really hard to convince people in that time because they needed to work. That was the bottom line. They couldn't really, it was really what the difference between the suffragettes is why there were more wealthy women, is because they could afford to do it. They didn't.
You had Sally, right? Was that her name? Who
Yes.
was a maid and came when she could.
Right.
Mostly had to work.
Yes, exactly. And really, probably the only reason she came is because her boss at the very end was a suffragist also. So she kind of like allowed her to go, but she almost had to choose between going on a date with her boyfriend and seeing a movie and going to a march or going to these meetings. Yeah, and that was really at the very end, because it was not common. I mean, just from the research I did, for these working class women to join the movement, they just really couldn't afford to go. So I tried to show the different parts of society and really the different parts of the suffragist women through Helen's world. That was really my goal. And there's one scene where she comes home, and it's like the super, like the janitor, the super's wife is like, or just even like the heckling that she got from the neighborhood women. They're like, first of all, they were just heckling her for what she was doing. And then they were like heckling her because she made more money. So it was like, she was kind of like, damned if she do and damned if she doesn't.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can I keep going, Shady, or do you have questions? I don't want to step on your question.
No, please.
So I also was really interested because you wrote, and maybe this comes from the fact that I write a lot of sort of intimate scenes, shall we say, in my books. But you wrote a few pretty intimate scenes with Helen and her husband, and then there was also a whole bit about her bringing home a condom.
Yeah.
Which I thought was so interesting historically, because I was like, I actually didn't know when these started being a thing.
Yeah. I actually had fun researching that.
I was going to ask you about your research, and then also about your how you felt about writing intimate scenes between a husband and wife.
Yeah.
Just because I know when I do it, I'm sort of closing my eyes half the time and thinking about the fact that like my grandma's gonna read this book.
Yes, and really, my children are reading this book. I have 2 daughters, 15 and 17. So I'm definitely, and I think all things considered, the intimate scenes I've written aren't as much as what you read out there or what they see on TV. So first of all, the process of how I wrote this book is I live and die and breathe by my writing class. Like, this book would not have gotten written if I hadn't been part of a writing class. So I'll just give a little plug to Westport Writers Workshop. I've been there for years. They're like first of all, the people I've met. So, and there's a few men, but the people in the class have become such good friends. But I will say, so here's people that we've read everything, we've heard everything, but yet when I was reading the scenes, I felt like I had to read with glasses on and a scarf over my head. I was so embarrassed. So it's funny that you say that. And I'm not it takes a lot to embarrass me. I think that this is where the nonfiction or the history or the feminism comes out, is that as women become more and more independent. So in this case, like, she really joined the suffragist movement. It was a job. It was a job that paid more. It was a job that, I'm sorry, we have 5 kids at home, so there's usually somebody here. It's a job that paid more. It was a job that sort of helped her grieve, helped her get past this. But that's really why she did it at first. And then when she gets more into it and she really gets seduced by the cause and becomes very passionate, it's like that's when she starts to hear her voice as a woman. And so the scene is that she thinks she's pregnant, and she never would have felt this before, but she's devastated. She's like, I can't have another baby right now. That means I have to stay home, or that's another mouth to feed, or it means like I'm sacrificing. And I think whether you're a mother or not, like, I think the not the choice to have a baby, but the emotions that go through when you decide to get pregnant or want to have a baby or decide not to have a baby, like, that's like an emotional roller coaster. So I tried to tap into that a little bit. And she initially is like, I don't have a choice here. There's nothing I can do. So, and I didn't, obviously talk about what she was going to do if she was pregnant. But then when she finds out she's not pregnant, so it was really just not a mistake, but she was not pregnant. She becomes friends with this woman. So I also want to show that she's becoming friendlier and becoming more friends with these other suffragist women. But the woman says, there's things you can do to not get pregnant. I mean, and Helen, like, she never had a mother who told her this. Like, they did not talk about this at all. And I think women in, like, today, I mean, people do talk about sex, but still, we don't talk about sex as much as we probably should. I mean, there's so much even today in 2021. So the fact that the woman is like, no, there's things that you can do to not get pregnant. And she is so afraid to tell Albert about it, like the emotions that arise with it, of her fear of her husband and just like what they're going to do and where they're going to buy it. And then the fact that, it's not a condom like made out of rubber like it is today, but it was made out of sheepskin. Is interesting. So yeah, so I actually had fun researching it, and I do think that that's something. Obviously, it's different today. Like women do with birth control, and we hopefully are educated about it, whether it's in the schools or through our families or our doctors. But the idea is that we still have those same feelings. Like, should we get pregnant? Should we not get pregnant? Should we choose to have children? Should we not? What are we going to do about it? How is this going to affect me? And even as the book was published during COVID, and I mean, for me, what was really so relevant in COVID with the news is how it affected women with childcare. That no matter, like, you can be the high income earner in your house, but you were home with the kids. And I saw that with my clients. I saw that with my sister. I mean, I was lucky enough that my kids were a little bit older, so I didn't have to homeschool them and I could keep working. But, anybody who had a small child during COVID, it didn't matter what you earned. You were like all of a sudden relegated to the 1920s, and you're home with your children. So there were many things that I felt that in this book that we can relate to as women today, as a modern woman. I know I'm going off on tangents, but
no, it's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll step back because Shady looks like she's going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say it is fascinating, and I think your research definitely shows through in that way. And I'm curious about other research that you did about the time, and especially choosing such an incredibly heightened time in history to tell the story of this woman's experience. I'm interested in kind of any rabbit holes that you might have gone down with your research. And
Well, it's funny because the first book that I read, historical fiction, that really was an impact on me was The Orphan Train. I can't remember the author of that. Is it Christina Baker Klein? No, The Orphan Train. Anyway, I loved the book. I read it probably 10 years ago. And while I've read historical fiction, and as a kid, I read a lot of books on the Holocaust, and I remember reading Roots, when I was a child, and so all these books to me were so impactful because it was like a fun way to learn about history without like sitting there in school, even though I liked school and did well in school and I teach at Barnard, but just, I don't know, it's a fun way to learn about a historical time. So that was one thought I had. So when I started taking writing classes, I thought, oh, let me just write historical fiction. And my first thing that I wanted to write about was Susan B. Anthony. I've always loved her. She's really the godmother of suffragists. She's the one who up in Seneca Falls. So I started researching her, and to be honest, it's 1850 and there just wasn't a lot that went on. It wasn't the most exciting time in history. And while she did so much, not much happened. I mean, if you really think about what happened when my book takes place from 1911 to 1919, it's like every year, I mean, between the Industrial Revolution, between World War I, between obviously women learning to vote, but the cars, I mean, just so that was a little bit I wrote actually about 6-8 chapters on the 1850s, 1870s, and I was like, I don't know if people really are going to want to read this. I'm not finding it that interesting, even though there was a lot there. So then just as someone, I was really seduced, truthfully, by the Industrial Revolution and what it did for our society. I think I've read that I don't want to quote it, but we grew in 10 years, we covered what 100 years took place from before. So that was number one. Number two, it's interesting. And I actually talk about this in my book. While I loved doing the research, I actually spent 10 years on Wall Street writing research. I actually am like a research analyst, and I really enjoyed that. I loved the people's stories, really just, and what was amazing to me is that I'm somebody who I think I'm well-read, and I realized how little I knew of this time. I didn't know Alice Paul's name. I didn't know Lucy Burns. I didn't know Harriet Stanton Blatch, and then all those women, at the very end, there's a really pivotal scene, which is truthfully why the vote got passed, or the amendment got passed. But the fact that we don't even know what happened to that prison, that it's not in our history books, or it's not something like, Jill, I didn't know if you'd heard that story.
Never.
Yeah, and it's a true story. It's a crazy story. So I don't want to give it away. I want people to read it to some extent.
No spoilers.
But just researching that, And it's funny, I don't have it on my bookshelf, in my office, but I bought this suffragist encyclopedia. I kept taking it out from the library. And then, they'd say you have to renew it every 3 weeks. And finally I'm like, let me just buy it for $25. And I bought it. And there was a lot that I didn't write about because I didn't know how to write it without making the novel sound like a history book. But there was a lot about the different states. Like the states out west actually did a lot with suffragist laws, like Colorado, Wyoming. They were able to pass some laws about allowing women to vote that we didn't hear on the East Coast, on the West Coast, excuse me, on the East Coast, yes. Or just like on the two coasts or, the big states. So there was a lot about that too. And just like anything, there were different factions. There were different women's groups who didn't get along, which is like anything. So it was fun for me to learn about it, but I actually didn't write about it. And then I also didn't really talk about, to me, I would say the one part of this book is there's like an absence of color because there really were no Black women involved in the movement. They just weren't allowed to be part of it, which is an absolute travesty. Absolute. So, after I wrote the book, I was like, gosh, my book is really white, which to me is just a glaring omission. But sadly, there just weren't a lot of women who did much around that time in terms of really allowing the law to be passed. And it's just, again, like they just weren't allowed to be part of it. They weren't included. So this was to me, the really pivotal historical things that I learned that, I hope that, one of my other goals, I want you to be entertained, but I also want you to learn these stories. You as the reader, you as to talk about it, just like, oh my God, I cannot believe that happened. I cannot believe that happened. Can you believe how they talk to each other?
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there have been so many historical fiction books that I have read recently, or even just straight like nonfiction books that I've read recently where I was like, what's going on with the school system? Why didn't I learn this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I felt that way when I was reading your book. I was like, what's going on here? Like, why is this not included and in the curriculum that gets taught in American classrooms?
And I also want to say that, with the suffragettes, which to me, I think is such an important part of our history, like there's very few books written on it. Like there's the Women's Hour, which is a nonfiction book that was written recently about what happened in Tennessee. And Tennessee was the last state, it was the state that really passed the law. So that was pretty just hugely important. But there's not a lot of historical fiction books around suffragettes, which I thought was like, well, why not? But then I also thought, oh, maybe this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I was thinking about, as I'm thinking about the history of suffragettes and how suppressed any narrative or history as they were making it, what was about them. Something that I was looking at as I was reading through this book was I don't know if you've seen that. You probably have, Galia, but they would make these caricatures, cartoons
Mm-hmm.
of the spinster archetype, or painting suffragettes out to be these angry, confused women who don't even know what they're talking about. Of course,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and
the
something.
cartoons were amazing. I actually had a lot of fun with the cartoons. Like my favorite one is a man holding a baby, and they're like, see what's going to happen if you let your wife become a suffragist. And he's holding the baby and the pot is boiling in the background. And like, God forbid he would take care of the baby
Right.
or help cook dinner and then too, like when I was researching it, the other thing is like I really learned about the British history involved with this, like Christine and Emmeline Pankhurst. And there's, that movie, I think it's called Suffragist, with Meryl Streep actually plays Emmeline Pankhurst, and Carey Mulligan plays like a factory worker. So just, and they were very, very different from the American suffragists. Like they actually practiced more violent methods, and Alice Paul actually trained with them. So that was true. So she went over to study in London, again, because she could afford to, but she did go there. And then she came home and said, I want to learn, but I'm still going to not be violent like they were. So again, like a part of history that I had no idea that these mother-daughter, they were mother-daughter, but yes, that they were spinsters, that they weren't married. And then I even remember like Mary Poppins. Like, I don't know if you remember the mother was a suffragist, and she came home with her white sash, marching, and the kids are marching, talking. And but do we remember that at all? Like when we watched the movie when we were, 10 years old.
I have to say, my
Absolutely.
sisters and I did march around singing that song.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Well done, sister suffragettes, right?
Yes, I don't remember. And by the way, I watched that movie about 50 times with my children, and I still was like, oh yeah, the mother was a suffragist. I think I just was so excited about the other songs, but yeah.
Not going to sing it for you right now, but I could.
Okay. When I meet you in person this summer in DC.
I also almost started singing just now, so we're singing our hearts. And I do want to ask you to read a little segment in just a moment, but I do have one more question related to what we were just talking about,
Mhm.
which was, and I will take a moment as well to encourage our viewers as you're watching, if you have questions for the author or for Jill, you can drop them into the comment section of the chat there, and I will relay your questions for you. But my question is, as you're talking about sort of the history and untold stories of so many suffragists, how do you see, like, what do you see that's different now, and how do you see these struggles still reflected in modern day when it comes to who gets to write the history and whose stories are prioritized or told?
Yeah, I think first of all, like I say this as a mother, that I see my daughter who's 17, who literally has a poster of AOC up in her bedroom. Like, I think that our children, just, and I'm not a teacher, but I mean, I do teach at Barnard, but just that I do think our children today are more aware, more engaged. They don't just accept things for the way they are. They're like, well, that's not right. I live in suburban Connecticut, in our little town, we've had a march for everything, for Black Lives Matters, for Stop Asian Hate, for anti-Semitism. So, both my kids are going, like, I'm not like dragging them. So I do think that our children, our next generation is just more awake, or more awoke, more engaged. So I do see that. And it's like warms my heart. It's almost like what, I think my parents were in the 60s and the 70s. And our generation kind of just wanted to make money, my generation. And then so our children are more engaged. So I do see that, which really like just makes me feel so great. Like, I remember taking my daughter to the Women's March 5 years ago. Or no, when was that? 5 years ago. And then your second question about what hasn't changed. So I think what hasn't changed, that, I mean, we're seeing voting laws, the fact that like these voting laws are being passed in Georgia recently. And I know that I wrote probably 1,000 postcards during the campaign, like, because of the voter suppression and voters being taken off the rolls. Like, why is that happening today in 2021 when we have democracy and every person's allowed to vote? Like, why is that still happening? So that tells me that we still have a lot more work to do. And hopefully this book will just make us do whatever you feel like you need to do to keep getting the vote out, getting people to vote, and just having conversations, really. Mhm. And by the way, I just want to quickly add, because Jill is very kind to be here tonight, is that, I was thinking about your book too. So Jill also is an author. And I read her book, which I love, Everything After. Just a little plug for Jill. But I don't want to give it away, but like one relevant theme, I was thinking about, like, what's the theme with your book and my book is like pregnancy and the choices we have around pregnancy, and like how it impacts us, and just really like making a decision about what you want, not just because like it's time to have a kid, or just because society says you should, or are you with the right person to have the child, or so I thought there were like a lot of relevant messages about like what women really want to do and say in our identity.
Yeah. Well, when you had the part in your book that you mentioned before, when Helen thinks she's pregnant and thinks like, I can't have a baby right now, I'm doing all these other things. And I actually thought about Emily in my book, and the way I think women trying to balance motherhood, if they want to become mothers at all, and also careers, if they want careers, and what that means. And I think it's something that Helen struggled with. It's something that,
Yes.
Emily struggles with. And I think it's something that women will struggle with in the future too, because your body is the thing that often makes the baby. So, there's, as someone who just had a baby 6 months ago, there's there's um there's a lot that comes with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I I know that I've always worked. I like to work. Working is very important to me, but definitely when I decided to have a baby, I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I have to work because we need the income, but how am I going to take care of this baby? But how am I can get an MBA in finance, no problem. I can do accounting. I can read balance sheets. I can, give talks like this, no problem. But really, how am I going to take care of a baby and work was to me, life-changing. So I really felt when Helen didn't want to get, was hoping she wasn't pregnant, I really felt that. I was like, oh my gosh, what if I at 30, I think she was 35 at the time, which is probably 45 today. What if I was pregnant in a time when all of a sudden she's really finding her voice and her identity, which she didn't have before.
Yeah.
And we could talk about this more and more.
I would love to apply, the new understanding that I and our viewers have of the book to a segment of
Yes.
a little excerpt if you've got something for me.
Okay. So I'm going to preface it that Helen, her daughter has died, unfortunately, tragically, and the suffragists, which by the way is true, went to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory because then many of them were labor union activists as well. And so it is true that they went there. So the book, they, sort of rescue her and they invite her, they help her out, they give her some money, and then they invite her to attend a meeting, like a rally. And she doesn't go for a few weeks, but then she finally goes. So this is her going to the first rally. Helen walked in late to the cavernous hall at Cooper Union. She looked around the vast space with just a few pieces of furniture and paused. So much space here and so little in it. The wood gleamed and she wondered how many women it took to keep it clean like that. She could barely keep the cobwebs out of the dark corners in her apartment. Alice Paul was standing on stage, already speaking. Helen did remember meeting her at Harriet's home the day of the fire, the day Abigail died. She couldn't recall if they had spoken or what was Alice's role in the suffragist organization. She was surprised to see her commanding authority. Was she a leader like Harriet? The early evening light barely lit the room as the gas lights flickered. She saw an empty seat next to a lady dressed in a corseted silk dress, but instead sat in the back of the room. Helen looked around at the hundreds of seated women, many in white outfits and sashes. She was overcome for a moment with thoughts of Abigail. Her mind flashed back again to the parade they stumbled upon months ago, walking back from the market. She'd been listening to Abigail chatter about this and that when they began to hear chanting and cheers. They rounded a corner and there was a wall of people. They'd stumbled upon a large suffragist parade going up First Avenue. Her daughter had been fascinated with the marches. She had even talked of someday joining them. Standing in that immense hall, she was reminded. She had told Abigail in no uncertain terms was she to get mixed up in that nonsense. It was too risky. But here she was, herself. If Abigail could see her now, Helen felt tears prick her eyes and she looked down for a moment. She smelled their lilac perfume, listened to their polite clapping, watched them nod their heads and murmur in agreement, and compared their tempered cheers with her rougher neighborhood. Her faded dark outfit accentuated how out of place she was. Her armpits felt damp with sweat. When Mrs. Blatch had invited her, she knew she had to come. It was true, as she told Albert. She wanted to understand more about the suffragettes because Abigail had been so captivated. It also seemed the suffragettes had some power in preventing an accident like the fire happening again. She desperately needed a distraction to take her mind off the grief of Abigail's death. Perhaps she had her own stirring of the suffragette cause of that parade. They said no one would join our cause. No one, Alice Paul exclaimed. Do you know how many women have signed up? She asked the audience. Hundreds? 500? 1,000? 3,000? The audience called out. No, 20,000. The crowd erupted with applause. Hats fell off heads. Hands were clapping in the air, and the floor shook with thunder. Helen found her own hands clapping alongside the crowd, caught up in the emotion. There are women from all walks of life, educated, immigrants, Gramercy Park to Delancey Street. Was Alice Paul telling the truth, Helen wondered? She looked around and was hard-pressed to see women like her from her neighborhood. These women smelled different. Talcum powder wafted in the air. Wait, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a small, modest hat. Maybe there were women like her. She stood straighter and moved from the back of the room, a few inches closer to the heart of her crowd, feeling the heat of the audience and clapping her hands in unison. They don't want us to vote. They won't want us to make decisions that matter. How are we supposed to vote for the politicians we agree with? How are we supposed to protect our families? We can't do that if we don't have the right to vote. Helen's eyes misted. It was too late for Abigail. She felt a pit in her stomach, nauseous, and hoped she wouldn't throw up. We have a voice. We need to use it. They need to hear us. If not for us, then our children. She thought about her children, Walter, Claudia, and Eleanor. It wasn't too late for them. They could have choices like these women. She couldn't leave now. She found herself merged with the group, adding her heat to the zeal of the crowd, not caring that she was sweating, that her hat was off her head, and even tempted to roll up her sleeves, her sweat smelling more feral as she hadn't bathed in over a week. As the meeting wrapped to a close, she felt a tap on her shoulder, turned around, and found herself face to face with Harriet Stanton Blatch. Mrs. Fox, do you have a few moments to speak before you leave? Helen nodded. She had already told Albert she would be late. She followed Harriet to a room in the back of the hall. Feeling the air cool quickly, she walked away from the crowd. The chatter diminished and her ears popped from the quiet. The room was small, overstuffed after the nearly empty hall. Boxes, pile of signs, and thick white ribbons were stacked to the ceiling. Mrs. Blatch immediately pulled out one of two small chairs at a table and sat down. What's all this? Helen asked, her eyes darting. Pamphlets, flyers, banners, and signs for our rallies and marches. Ooh, I'm tired. These late nights are catching up to my old bones, Harriet sighed. What did you think of the speeches tonight? Helen nodded her head with a small smile. Alice Paul is tremendous. She really knows how to connect with women on every level. We are very fortunate to have her. You know, she learned her suffrage tactics in England with Emily Pankhurst. Helen had no idea who she was, but assumed someone famous the way Harriet seemed impressed. She continued, we're in different parties. I founded the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, and Alice Paul has her congressional union. However, we have the same mission and work together all the time. She finally asked, Helen, we are looking for more women to get involved with the cause. Harriet paused. More women like you? I would like to attend another meeting or rally, Helen said. That's not what I mean, Harriet continued. We need women on the ground working with our organization. Why me? Helen asked. I see resilience in you. I wasn't sure if you were going to come. It would be a challenge for anyone to move forward after the tragedy you've been through, but here you are. I believe that they, the politicians, men, need to hear your story from you. Helen nodded. Was she ready to share her grief, her anger with the public? They needed to hear, but would that even do anything? We need women from different parts of the city, such as your neighborhood. Helen took a deep breath, squinting her eyes. You know, Mrs. Fox, my mother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was one of the original suffragists with Susan B. Anthony. She died very tired. She devoted her life to the movement, neglecting my siblings and me tremendously so. Yet we wouldn't be as progressive if it weren't for her. But she did die tired. Harriet hesitated. We're trying to do it differently and register as many women as we can so that we can see this to the finish line. The cause truly needs women like you. She continued, what if your job and working for the suffragettes were the same? Helen scrunched her face. The League is hiring with a salary. We have the funds, so you can continue to get a paycheck. Why not devote your hard work to us instead? How much will she pay me? Helen thought, looking down at her worn boots. We can pay a weekly salary of $12, Harriet offered. That's more than double what they pay me at the factory, Helen raised her eyebrows, but kept it to herself. What will Albert say when he finds out I'm making more than him, she thought. Was she really devoted to the suffragettes, or was this just an outlet for her to right the wrong of Abigail's death? What would Abigail even say about her mother working for them? Why don't you sleep on it? Come by the office in the next few days and we can discuss more of the details. I'll be there every evening. Now it's much later than usual. Let's get us both home. Can I please drop you off with my carriage? Helen shook her head, finally able to speak. Thank you, Mrs. Blatch. Thank you for your belief. I'll get myself home. She had a lot of thinking to do. What was Albert going to say to all this? Oh, I love that scene.
It's a beautiful scene, and I think it carries so much so much of the sort of heft of the feeling of the story in it. Just looking around, I'm picturing like looking around at the all the hats of the women at the
Mhm.
rally, I think.
That was
And
actually one of my first titles. Was it was either going to be like the small hat or the big hat, because a little bit the size of your hat was like the size of your, like, bank account back then, like the small hats versus like the really big hats.
definitely.
When did people stop wearing hats?
I don't know, 50s, 60s,
Not
maybe.
too bad. Hats are great.
Yeah. And Cooper Union, they actually did have a rally in Cooper Union Hall, which is a gorgeous hall in New York. I lived in New York City for 20 years, so it was fun to research that a little bit. And I purposely didn't go to the Tenement Museum until after I wrote the book, because I was afraid that, you don't want to watch something or read something that you're afraid is going to influence your book subconsciously. So, but then I went.
I love in that scene where she sees the other woman with a small hat, and then it makes her feel brave.
Yeah.
And it made me think so much about um, feeling like you belong in a space, and that for so many different reasons there are people who don't feel like there's a space that they can enter, but when there's someone else there who either looks like them or acts like them or is dressed like them, um, it makes things feel more welcoming.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I thought that scene just did it so beautifully.
Yeah.
It really got that feeling across so perfectly.
Yeah, and she really, and I think that's a theme, is that she's always looking for somebody like her. Like when she decides to go to Washington and she meets, God, I'm blanking on the woman's name. That was actually the other passage I was going to read. And she realizes that this is a woman, I think her name was Elizabeth, that they have so much in common. She's like, oh my gosh, I have something in common with one of these women. She's actually like me, even though maybe our backgrounds are a little bit different, but we actually have something in common. Like, you're right, she instantly feels like, validated, verified.
And
Mm-hmm.
more comfortable.
Yeah.
I think that's, I mean, one of the really cool things about your book is you see that women from all different walks of life all have this connection.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right. We just want to feel part of something. We want to be included. Like, we want to feel love. We want to have a connection in so many different things. And I think that most of us want to have a purpose. And obviously, like, our children, if we have children, or if our work, but many of them didn't have work. Like, if they worked, it was because they had to work.
right.
And that was actually when the first book the first edit or the first draft, um, I spent a lot of time talking about Abigail getting the job at the Triangle Shirtwaist, and Helen and Albert were dead set against it. They did not want her working, but then they realized that they actually need the money.
Yeah.
They don't have a choice. And I mean, look, the Triangle Shirtwaist, most of the girls who died there were 12 and 13 years old. And that's the truth. Like, most of these girls worked there because their family needed the money.
Yeah. Awful.
Which is another reason that the line that really struck me in the excerpt that you just read was, "She died very tired." That struck me straight to my heart. Just that the exhaustion and weight that so many women then and now kind of carry on their shoulders
Mm-hmm.
as the responsibility for their families, for their spouses, for their children, and for their own well-being, just kind of entirely centered on the depletion of their own bodies and well-being
It's a
as well.
sacrifice. Yeah, I think what was eye-opening for me too, these women that I researched, is the passion they had. Like, I feel strongly about things, but I don't think I've like sacrificed my life. Like, these women like sacrificed their life, truly sacrificed. Like, Alice Paul did not have children, did not get married. So she didn't, and she actually was courted, and people did want to marry her, but she just felt so passionate. And there were many suffragists who were married and had children, but the passion that these women felt, like, they really were like, we don't have a choice. So I thought that was interesting, that to feel this like fervor, not even commitment, but just this passion where you really feel like you don't have a choice and you devote your life to it, is remarkable. Like, today, can you imagine doing that? And today we have so much more than they had 100 years ago.
When you had that beautiful scene at the end between, or toward the end, between Helen and her daughter Claudia,
Mhm.
where Claudia says, "You're the only mom who looks happy to go to work."
I know.
And sort of how wonderful it was that Helen could model that for Claudia, and that could be a thing,
Right.
that Claudia hadn't realized before, that work was something you could enjoy. It wasn't something that that you necessarily had to dread going to every day.
Right, right. Because again, most of the women, like her role models or the people that she saw working, were people who didn't have money, or were working again because they had to. And where were they working? Like domestic help, or they were working in factories or seamstresses or laundry. So, these are not, these are low pay, not high satisfaction jobs by any means. Hmm.
No, I mean, Helen needed to work too, but she was able to find work in something she could enjoy.
Right. No, she was very, very fortunate. I mean, and that's obviously, that was the fun part of the fiction, is like making up a character like Helen. And I actually feel like Helen's alive. Like, I feel like Helen really existed. First of all, I've been writing about Helen for 6 years, on and off. I really started this 6 years ago. And so to me, Helen is like absolutely, like, she was alive and well. She died. She survived what happened at the end. She passed the baton. She died in her sleep.
Grandchildren on her knee.
Yes, exactly. Has her, has a grave in Queens, like most of the.
I would love to. We have a few more minutes, so I'd love to sort of move into a discussion between the two of you on some of the overarching topics that we've kind of read up. We talked a little bit about before we started streaming here. But as we're discussing this book, I'd also love to hear each of your opinions, as you are both authors, about what are the emerging themes and messages that we're seeing in literature now. How does it relate to the Accidental Suffragist, and also to other works that you might have coming out, and sort of what do you see happening in literature that is striking you?
Um, I find that, to me, and I'm probably gearing, like, I just read The Lost Apothecary this past weekend. I think, to me, that there's more and more of the books about are women finding their identity. And it could be just as little as, like, did I marry the right person? Did I take the right job? But it's just really women. And there's no question that I read books more, with a female main character. But, and even today in 2021, like, we're still searching for identity and who we are, and that's our path. So to me, that's so much of it is just women, like, really finding what is their identity, breaking maybe against norms that is expected of them with society, or maybe their specific society. I just started Infinite Country, and that's obviously with immigrants. um, I believe it's in Colombia. um, and so they're, very, very typecast, or very fit into a very narrow area. So what's expected of us. So that's, to me, a theme that I see.
Yeah. I think related to that, I've seen a lot of women finding their voice and finding their passion.
Mhm.
And I think that relates very much to your book. And also tends to be a lot of what I write about too. Um, the idea of discovering who you are, and then how to take who you are and make something more of that.
Mhm.
Whether it's in the arts, in society, in figuring out a way to use your own passion to help the world.
I think that there's also you have, like, there's expectations of what people want from you, like, whether if you're in a relationship, like what your spouse or partner wants from you, what your family wants from you. Like, your family might, whether it's religious, or like wants you to go a certain way, or maybe you study something in college and then you have to get the job in that area. And then, so it's like very often we're making choices that goes against, like, what society, or what, we were sort of studying to do or doing. Um,
Something you said, Galia, earlier keeps circling back for me as well when you're talking about how this book is an undeniable work of feminist literature. but it's also intended to be for all audiences to enjoy. And I think something that you both have said just now kind of strikes me too, that these stories that we start seeing come out um, are finally, in the voices of marginalized people, women, trans people, queer people, people of color are finally gaining that agency over their own stories. And simultaneously, we're discovering that these stories can be told as if they are a matter of course, and it's not a niche or a specialty story that belongs in this little corner of your bookshelf. It's a human story.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that that I've been thinking about a lot in reference to the Accidental Suffragist, but just in about literature in general.
Mhm.
Watching these stories finally be told uh, within their own context and in their own voice. But I do want to talk to you both a little bit about the place of women in the tradition of storytelling, and sort of what your experience has been over the years of being readers and writers, but also where you see that changing as well, the role of the woman in the story, so to speak.
Do you want to go or I can?
If you want to go ahead.
Um, I think if you look sort of through, I went to Columbia University, right? And you start with the core curriculum of the great literary works of Western civilization. And basically almost every single one of them is a white man until you get pretty close to where we are now. And I think that, what you were saying before about people being able to tell their stories, because I think in the past it wasn't, unless you were an absolutely exceptional person, there was no real way or opportunity for a lot of people to share their stories. And now I think the fact that women can write their own stories and can tell their own stories, therefore the characters of women are taking on um, more importance, and people are able to see women as the protagonists of the story, not as the alsos in the story. um, and I think that's true for a lot of marginalized communities, where you can see lots of people becoming the protagonists and not the alsos.
Mhm.
And I've been thinking a lot about the label women's fiction, because my books are labeled women's fiction. And initially, the first time I saw that, I thought, like, hey, why can't my book be everyone fiction?
Right. Right. Mhm.
I sort of now have been wearing it as a badge of honor that, like,
Mhm.
yes, my books are about women and my audience is majority women. And I think that the fact that we've now created a space where there are stories by women about women for women, that that's kind of awesome,
Mhm.
because that wasn't a thing for so long.
Mhm. I think what struck me is that, and I did not study literature, I studied finance, but when I really got into reading the classics on my own, like all the classics are written by men. Ernest Hemingway, of Scott Fitzgerald. My mind is blanking on the others. So, I think that it's like, you were saying, Jill, like we were the alsos, like, and even like some of the historical fiction books that I loved were like the Paris wife or the architect. It was like the architect's wife. Like, it was like the women were just like the secondary character, and like we're not. I mean, none of us are secondary characters. We're all main characters in our own right. So for me, it's really important to write it from a viewpoint that hasn't necessarily been written from, even though it has been, like with women's fiction. So I think we're, making up for. And I do think whether it's what we want, but I think women are also just much more privy to the family matters in terms of what's really going on in the heart of a family. And that to me is the root of so much of what I want to hear about, because that's like the emotional heartbeat and the emotional connection to family. And I think you can, and look, there's many dysfunctional mothers, and I've read some great books with the mother can really wreak havoc on children's lives. And what is it? The one Running with Scissors, like you read, those books. His book was it August Burroughs, again, a man writing it. But I think just reading about the viewpoint of what happened, like how we were raised from the women's point of view, and really how that affected us and how that affects us going forward. Like I just read this book called The Push, which I don't know if anyone's read it, and it's multi-generational. It's all written from the women's point of view, like the grandmother, the mother, and then the main character, and you just see how these women influence how these families evolve from the 50s on. So it was really, really fascinating. So I think that we will only more and more see the women's viewpoint and not letting women or anybody else be marginalized. Mm-hmm. And I love, like, for example, The Vanishing Half, which is probably, I think, one of the best books I've ever written. Like, the men are secondary characters in that one. And I love it that it's about the sisters and their daughters, or their relationship, their mother. Like, the men, the husbands, the boyfriends are really secondary.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming up on our time here.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation. If we want to end
Yes.
on
Yes.
a bit of a closing note, if you would like to offer our viewers any last words, who is this book for?
Yes.
Who do you want to reach with your words?
Well, first, I want to say a huge plug. Please go buy this book, my book, and Jill's book at Lost City Books. And the website is, I have it up here, Lost City Books?
It'll be lostcitybookstore.com.
Yes,
And
lostcitybookstore.com. Yeah, so please go buy my book, buy Jill's book at lostcitybookstore.com. Write a review, let us know how it is, pass it on. So that's number one. Number two, I hope that you're swayed by the story. I really hope that you're moved by Helen's. I don't want to tell you what's going to happen at the end. I think the end is fantastic. There's also the mid part of the book, which we didn't even talk about, is the parade, where they go march in this parade in Washington, D.C. the day before Wilson is inaugurated. And it's just a pivotal, they made a whole movie about it. That's how pivotal it is, Iron Jawed Angels. So there's a lot of really, really big arcs in this book that to me just shows like how far that women will come, and also just the power of getting swept up in a movement. So I hope you feel that swept upness, and you feel that like emotion like overcoming you, and you're just rooting for Helen. And trust me, there's some down moments with her where she has some pretty big things that she's to overcome. So I hope you feel that.
absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you both.
Yes, thank you, Shady.
For
Thank you,
joining.
Jill. Thank you, both of you.
Much.
For our viewers, if you're watching now and you'd like to grab this book, the link has been dropped in the chat there. And you can also just and you can also just walk right on up to our store. We're on 18th Street in Adams Morgan, Northwest DC. We've got a lot of great selections and a lot of great authors to choose from. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have to come and say hi in person.
Yes.